So there's an anti-Islamophobia motion being pushed by a Liberal MP in Canadian Parliament. And I think it's something that needs to be discussed. As most of you will know, Alexandre Bissonnette, a 27-year-old Quebec man, murdered 6 people in a shooting at a Quebec City mosque on January 29th, 2017. And from this, a lot of emotional reactions have been spawned. One such reaction, and possibly the most potentially harmful of them all, has been Parliamentary Motion M-103, as put forward by Mississauga MP Iqra Khalid. Now, if we can, I'd like to take a look at this motion and try to expand everyone's understanding of it, its pros, its cons, and the most likely ramifications in the event that the motion, as it is worded currently, is passed. Now, first things first. If we want to understand the motion, we'll need to know its content and phrasing before moving on to the analysis portion of this video. So, here it is. Parliamentary Motion M-103. That the government should, quote, recognize the need to quell the increasing public climate of hate and fear, condemn Islamophobia and all forms of systemic racism and religious discrimination, and take note of House of Commons Petition E411 and the issues raised by it, and request that the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage undertake a study on how the government could, 1. Develop a whole-of-government approach to reducing or eliminating systemic racism and religious discrimination, including Islamophobia, in Canada, while ensuring a community-centered focus with a holistic response through evidence-based policymaking. And 2. Collect data to contextualize hate crime reports and to conduct needs assessments for impacted communities, and that the committee should present its findings and recommendations to the House no later than 240 calendar days from the adoption of the motion, provided that, in its report, the committee should make recommendations that the government may use to better reflect the enshrined rights and freedoms in the Constitution Acts, including the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. End quote. So, there it is. Motion M-103, word for word. What's so treacherous about it, though? Well, let's cover some of the key words and phrases in the motion and see where these words and phrases would guide the motion's interpretation if it were to be passed. Now, first, I'd like to take a look at the central issue of the motion. It's singling out of Islamophobia as something to be condemned, and feelings of which, well, that needs to be quelled. Yeah. Now, I don't know exactly what Iqra Khalid means by her use of Islamophobia, since she didn't provide her working definition. So, I'm going to default to the Oxford English Dictionary, as Canadian law defers to what a, quote, reasonable individual, end quote, would interpret from a law or policy, and the Oxford English Dictionary is what I see as being the standard for a reasonable person. To that end, Oxford defines Islamophobia as, quote, dislike of or prejudice against Islam or Muslims, especially as a political force, end quote. Dislike or prejudice. Dislike or prejudice. Alrighty then. Now this is, to me, the most concerning part of the motion and the part that has drawn the most backlash from the public. The reason I have an issue with this is simple. Phrasing. As a term, Islamophobia has implications, especially when using the Oxford definition and many other popular definitions that would absolutely result in assaults on freedom of expression. If there must be a quote-unquote whole-of-government approach to condemning Islamophobia, then there will inevitably be crackdowns on the Canadian right to freedom of expression, as condemning the dislike of a specific religious ideology cannot coexist with the freedoms in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, specifically the freedom of conscience and religion, Section 2A, freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression, including freedom of the press and other media of communication, Section 2B, and every individual is equal and under the law and has the right to the equal protection and equal benefit of the law without discrimination and, in particular, without discrimination based on race, ethnicity, sex, so on and so forth, as laid out in Section 15.1 of the same Canadian Charter. Now, sure, Section 15.2 essentially negates the principles of the first, but I typically disregard it as the politically correct nonsense that it is and act in the principle of the legislation. Now, if Motion M-103 were to be passed, the government would be obligated to put in place a series of laws and policies preventing citizens from being able to freely and without undue repercussion voice their criticisms and or dislike of Islam. You know, the ideology responsible for the vast majority of terror attacks perpetrated over the last decade, and whose prophet was a warmongering pedophile, and whose adherents regularly shoot and or blow up followers of the various Islamic sects for believing in the wrong interpretation of Islam. Now shit, there's a notion for you. Muslims being told they can't criticize other Muslims' interpretation of the Islamic faith. Who am I kidding? Their version of Islam permits and encourages the attacks on other sects, so to stop them would just be an act of government-sanctioned Islamophobia. It really does become just one vicious cycle in practice, doesn't it? Now, next up on the list of concerning words and phrases from Motion M-103, we have systemic racism. As always, before confronting a concept, I do like to establish a basic understanding of it, both in terms of its definition and how it is represented in common situations in life. Now, as per, again, the Oxford English Dictionary, institutional racism, the redirect definition for systemic racism, is defined as racial discrimination that has become established as normal behavior within a society or organization. Now, working from this definition, a whole-of-government approach to reducing or eliminating systemic racism could be applied not only in the form of arbitrary quotas in government, which the Liberal Party has shown itself to be so very fond of, but also in the form of legislation governing the daily conduct of Canadian citizens. Except, of course, those who plead a case of disadvantage based on their, quote, race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, or mental or physical disability, end quote, as laid out in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Section 15, subsection 2, which allows for preferential or, quote, affirmative action, end quote, treatment of individuals proclaiming such status. Now, of course, in practice, in everyday life, we see article after article and university speech after university speech given and published about how systemic racism and institutional racism ranges anywhere from why the primaries are racist in the U.S. all the way down to microaggressions, and that they're just ingrained, they're just absolutely a part of our society. So ask yourself, how is it that such legislation would most likely be employed? Folks, this is where I come off script and do a little bit of a seat of my pants bit on this whole issue. I was inspired to create a video based on this topic, Parliamentary Motion M-103, by Dr. Jordan Peterson, who has been a very outspoken proponent of free speech here in Canada ever since his extremely vocal opposition of Bill C-16, which unfortunately was still passed. Unfortunately, I have been without a computer for some time now, And I've also been feeling like absolute dog shit the last couple of days. As you might be able to tell, I still have a bit of a scratch in my voice and a little bit of a nasally sound from the lovely sinus condition brought on by this cold or whatever the hell it is. Because of this, I've been unable to put together a really solid video, and I've been forced to write my script out by hand. This is why you'll probably hear the rustling of papers and everything else, as again, I'm recording this all from my smartphone. I couldn't leave this any longer. I know that every second and every day that goes by that another video isn't created and another statement isn't made in opposition of this motion, we become closer and closer, to being in a country where simply disliking a religion becomes something illegal, becomes something that the government can punish you for. Now, it does say religious discrimination in her motion, in M-103 as put forward by Iqra Khalid, but it doesn't give any religion-specific terms aside from Islamophobia, which is the only part of this, and in its singling out of Islam, that criminalizes dislike of a religion. Now, on the face of it, without any further clarification of the wording, which has not been provided as part of the written statement on the government's website, and you can find the written text of M103 on, I believe it's parl, PARL.gc.ca. You cannot find the working definition for Islamophobia, which means that in practice, it is whatever the government and the judiciary decides for it to be. Seeing how things have been going recently, with the change of the national anthem, again for no real good reason, and with the imposition of Bill C-16 to change the Constitution Acts to include gender identity as a protected ground, I cannot help but think that Islamophobia will be employed in the same regressive method as these last two bits of policy have been. The changing from "in all thy sons" command to "in all of us" command, and the inclusion of gender identity as a protected field. This is not something that I want to see happen to the country I love. I'm very proud to be a Canadian and to uphold what I feel have always been, or at least in my lifetime and the decades preceding it, traditional Canadian values. I do not hold it against someone if they choose to believe in a certain faith, so long as their actions do not cause unjust pain or suffering to those around them. If you are a Christian, if you are a Hindu, if you are a Jainist, I don't care what it is you practice in your own home, provided that certain rights are maintained. The issue here is that there does seem to be one particular religious ideology in the world today that does things a little differently from the rest of the developed Western ideologies. It would not be the first time that a girl or a woman was the victim of an honor killing in even just my province by somebody following the tenets of Islam. It would not be uncommon to see a mosque segregated based on biological sex or gender. I do not believe that men and women should be split up based on their gender. I do not believe that women and girls should have to fear having acid thrown in their face, or being stabbed to death, or being choked to death, or being trapped in a car and driven off of a bridge into a causeway to be intentionally drowned. These are all incidents that have happened in my province alone, and they have all occurred based on the tenets of Islam being brought to practice. If this motion gets passed, my simply making this video would be a criminal act in my country. I happen to find that disgusting. Now, I'm all for throwing the book at Alexandre Bissonnette for what he did. He murdered 6 people whom, by any accounts, were innocent individuals, and injured many more. He had no right to do what he did. He had no right to inflict violence and death upon people. However, the emotional pain and the understandable emotional pain being felt by communities across Canada is not justification for hasty and dangerous legislation. As we know from the example of the United States and the Patriot Act following September 11th's World Trade Center and Pentagon attacks, putting into place legislation immediately following a tragedy, or in general, as a piece of emotional release, as a way to respond, or I should say more accurately, react emotionally to an incident. It's extremely harmful, and it does not end well. I always, whenever I am in clear a mind myself, I always advocate for waiting and trying to let cooler heads prevail. And that is not what is taking place currently in the House of Parliament. We elect our representatives to coolly, calmly, and logically do what is best for the nation. And it is in my belief that putting forward this motion was not something that was done coolly, that was done in a calm or rested state of mind, and in point of fact was done as a reaction, a knee-jerk reaction to the January 29th Quebec City mosque shooting. So, if you're like me and you believe in freedom of speech and freedom of expression, freedom of thought, of conscience, and you believe that all people, regardless of their religion, their faith, their race, their skin tone, their age, their sex, their mental or physical disability, if you believe that all people should be entitled to the equal protection under the law, then you must oppose Motion 103, because this motion aims to create a protected and privileged class in Canada based upon religion, based upon someone's beliefs that, if following the text to a T, result in some pretty barbaric practices. Now that will be all for this video. I do intend on making a much better quality one with, of course, the visuals of the pertinent texts in this case. However, I don't have, again, the editing potential on my phone. so this will have to do. If you have any questions about the motion, about links as to where to find the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and other pertinent laws regarding equality and such things in Canada, I'll have a couple of links in the description, and you can always message me either on Twitter or comment in the section down below. I recognize that this is going to be a very hotly contested topic, and as such, I would ask that those of you who do leave comments try to keep them as civil as possible. I am by no means mandating perfect cordiality or politeness. I understand that this is going to be something that's going to be fought over. But try to keep it between the buoys, okay? With that all said, I would like to wish everyone a good evening and good night. And of course, thank those of you who support me on Patreon, because without you guys, I wouldn't be able to afford to have my computer fixed properly. I will, as soon as I graduate, or at least should say as soon as this semester ends, put the money that I will be taking from my Patreon funds back into the Ride for Change. I pledged previously that it would go directly to that. Unfortunately, I think it's in the best interest of myself and long-term the Ride for Change that I get my computer up and running ASAP. Hope you won't hold it against me. Either way, folks, thank you for listening, and please do look into this issue, especially if you are a Canadian watching this, because this is something that stands a very good chance at having a drastic impact on our country. Thank you.